In the latter half of the 19th century, many reforms began to take place. Women were looking for the right to vote, emancipation of the slaves after the Civil War led to new laws to be developed, and the new lives of urban dwellers became something that was really important to focus in on during this time period. Civil service reform was important because during this time period, many of the people who were in government were there because of who they knew. So you could buy your position. You would give it as a reward to someone who supported you and helped you get into office. These sorts of things. So there is now a new civil service exams and such that are trying to make it more of a position of not honor but of need to be part of the government. Cities and urban development became a huge issue during this time period. People began to start doing things cheaper, so therefore we had buildings made out of wood instead of out of bricks and concrete, which led to more fires. We also had horrible sanitation, and we needed a way to get clean water. New sewage systems were built, infrastructure was created, and cities were now becoming more organized. Housing services were now beginning to become an issue that were developing because many saw the way that the poor were living as a really horrible way or a bad way of living in the United States. And now the majority of the people in the United States were living in cities, whereas before most of the Americans were living in rural areas. Jane Addams pioneered the first settlement houses. This concept was started in Chicago. Many people think of New York as the first place for these sorts of things, but Chicago was the second largest city in the United States at the time, and lots of reforms were coming out of Chicago. Transportation reform in San Francisco, that we now had cable cars and railroads were common all over the United States. People were able to travel now and get from place to place a lot easier than just from horseback or riding in the past. The Brooklyn Bridge was created. This was the largest bridge of its time that was able to connect Brooklyn and Manhattan to one another, and which helped the cost of living overall for those in New York City. The temperance movement was a movement that developed at the end of the century and into the beginning of the 1900s. Not only did we see things where Native American tribes started to banish alcohol, but it was now pushing on into the mainstream. So this whole idea of prohibition developed during this time period. Women's suffrage. Women were now fighting for the right to vote. By 1896, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho had all granted women's suffrage. They were looking for a new amendment to be created to allow women the right to vote, which happened in 1920. Civil rights in this time period is not something we're used to thinking about. Most people think about the civil rights after World War II, but it was a huge thing. The Jim Crow laws were passed during this time where separate was equal in their minds. As long as you were able to provide the same sort of schooling and different types of programs, then it was considered equal by many. This was not just in the South. It did happen all over the United States, but mainly in the South.